Good afternoon. Welcome to Inside the Psychologist studio with Danny Kahneman. Danny Kahneman was born in Tel Aviv in 1934 while his mother was visiting relatives. He spent his childhood years in Paris, where his parents had emigrated from Lithuania in the early 1920s. Danny and his family were in Paris when it was occupied by Nazi Germany in 1940. His father was picked up in the first major roundup of French Jews, but was released after 6 weeks due to the intervention of his employer. The family was on the run for the remainder of the war and survived intact except for the death of his father of diabetes in 1944. Danny and his family then moved to Palestine, which soon became Israel, in 1946. Danny has written about his experience in Nazi-occupied France, explaining in part why he entered the field of psychology. It must have been late 1941 or early 1942. Jews were required to wear the Star of David and to obey a 6 p.m. curfew. I had gone to play with a Christian friend and had stayed too late. I turned my brown sweater inside out to walk the few blocks home. As I was walking down an empty street, I saw a German soldier approaching. He was wearing the black uniform that I had been told to fear more than others, the one worn by specifically recruited SS soldiers. As I came closer to him, trying to walk fast, I noticed that he was looking at me intently. Then he beckoned me over, picked me up, hugged me. I was terrified that he might notice the star inside my sweater. He was speaking to me with great emotion in German. When he put me down, he opened his wallet, showed me a picture of his boy, and gave me some money. I went home more certain than ever that my mother was right. People were endlessly complicated and interesting. Danny received his Bachelor's of Science with a major in psychology and a minor in mathematics from Hebrew University in Jerusalem in 1954. After obtaining his undergraduate degree, he served in the psychology department of the Israeli Defense Forces. One of his responsibilities was to evaluate candidates for officer training school and to develop tests and measures for that purpose. In 1958, he went to the United States to earn his PhD in psychology from the University of California, Berkeley in 1961. Danny's collaboration with Amos Tversky began after he invited Amos to give a guest lecture at one of his seminars at Hebrew University, sometime during the period of 68 to 69. Their first jointly authored paper, Belief in the Law of Small Numbers, was published in 1971. They published 7 articles in the next several years. Among these was Prospect Theory and Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases. Danny left Hebrew University in 1978 to take a position at the University of British Columbia, and his move had no effect on his collaboration with Tversky, since Tversky had moved to Stanford that same year. When Kahneman and Tversky were both fellows at the Center of Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford in 77-78, he met a young economist by the name of Richard Thaler, who was visiting professor at the Stanford branch of the National Bureau of Economic Research during that same year. According to Danny, Thaler and I soon became friends and have ever since had considerable influence on each other's thinking. Building on prospect theory and Kahneman and Tversky's body of work, Thaler published Toward a Positive Theory of Human Choice in 1980, a paper which Kahneman has called the founding text in behavioral economics. Richard Thaler is the Ralph and Dorothy Keller Distinguished Service Professor of Behavioral Science and Economics at the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business. Given Dick Thaler's long and close association with Danny, he's graciously agreed to serve as the interviewer. Please join me in welcoming Danny Kahneman and Dick Thaler.
Well, thanks, John, and thanks to all of you for coming. This is terrific. The passages that John was quoting from come from Danny's autobiography, which is posted on the Nobel website. And it's very nice reading. I reread it yesterday to prepare for these questions, and we'll try to ask things that aren't in that. So, Danny, I haven't seen you since lunch. You grew up in Paris, as John said, and went to Israel as a teenager. But your English has no traces of Hebrew or French accents. Why not?
I bounced around a lot. I actually learned English when we moved to Israel. I learned English before I learned Hebrew because nobody knew French. And I had an American aunt. And then I have an English wife. But I don't know what accent I have.
Yeah, it's not French or Hebrew. In the autobiography, you talk about your graduate training and say how different it is from the training today. There was little pressure to publish and no emphasis on formal apprenticeship. Is today's system better? And are there any drawbacks?
You can't imagine actually how different it is from what it was like to be a graduate student. There was a real sense of intellectual freedom. The structure was just structure of exams. You were supposed to know all of psychology, and still at that time. I mean, we had prelims on all of psychology at the end of the first or second year. We could take courses in anything, and although many of us, were attached to one professor or another, it wasn't compulsory. And really, publication was secondary. Mostly at that time, I'm talking late 50s, early 60s, you got a job on recommendations. It was all a network, and I can say, it was a male network, and that's how you found jobs. So it was a different experience. Whether it's better or worse, hard to know. I mean, one thing is that I felt I was a general psychologist when I emerged from, and I'm not sure. I think graduate students today are a lot more specialized.
It's actually, I now know you well enough to be able to predict your answers, so that this leads perfectly into my next question, which is, I saw somewhere recently that Robin Dawes, our friend Robin Dawes, was referred to as a non-hyphenated psychologist. That could apply to you as well.
I hope so.
Is this a species that will soon be extinct?
I hope not, and I believe not. I mean, there are plenty of us who are sort of interested in more than one field, and if we don't learn them all at once in graduate school, we'll learn them sequentially in the course of a career. And, it doesn't take knowing all of psychology to be a non-hyphenated, I mean, Robin and I know 2 or 3 areas reasonably well. It's not...
But the trend seems to be toward 2 hyphens. Social cognition, or...
That's very true. And social neuroscience, I mean, now, of course, we're getting increasingly specialized.
Your first big hit paper used pupil dilation to measure effort. Are there any hints of the future Danny Kahneman in that paper?
Well, not really. I mean, I think that those 2 strands of work, my strand of work on attention and on effort, which led to a book that I published while Amos and I were still had begun to work. So for a few years, I was carrying out both lines of work together. But there never was a very strong influence of the work on attention on the work that we did. It's only recently, I would say very recently, that I've come back to merge the 2 lines of thinking, because now there is dual system theory, and I view myself as a dual system theorist, and now that gets you back into thinking of effort and lack of effort, and that is actually a very pleasant feeling. But for a very long time, there was really no connection. I just saw that connection, I think, regained the connection about, 10 years ago or less.
So here's a 2-part question. A, is it true you wrote that book mainly to impress Ann Treisman? And B, and I think knowing Ann, I think I know the answer to this, Did you ever succeed in impressing that Treisman?
Well, I mean, you know, the short answers are yes and no. Yeah. But, you know, it's, I got into writing the book because of Anne. I mean, you know, 4 years after her PhD, it's a story I told because she had her sort of festschrift a week ago, and 4 years after her PhD, she gave a triumphal colloquium tour all over the United States, which, you know, is sort of unbelievable today. But, so she gave a talk that was joint at MIT and Harvard. It was a very good talk. And I was impressed by the talk and by the lady, and that eventually led to attention and effort. That is true. And Anne was not a great fan of attention and effort. She thought it was pretty good, but no.
Well, I know what she thinks about our work on fairness, but I can't mention it.
No, you cannot.
So, moving right along, your collaboration with Amos was obviously a huge success, of course. Part of the success of the team was that you had complementary skills. Part was attributable to the fact that you enjoyed each other's company. But even in hindsight, are there any lessons young scholars can take from this success story? How can we create successful academic partnerships, or was it just a lucky alignment of the stars?
Well, in the first place, of course, it was, you know, enormously lucky. I mean, it didn't have to happen that way, and you know, the whole thing was luck. But in terms of collaborations, you know, I have collaborated all my life, so I believe that collaboration is in part a sort of a character trait. You know, you like, and Amos was also very social in his work. And so when you get two people who just, you know, like to schmooze while they work and, you know, like to take long walks and gossip and so on, and you give them a lot of time to spend together, which we had. I mean, we took that time. Then things can happen. And I mean, certainly my advice to people is that if you are the collaborating type, don't waste the opportunity, because it is so much more fun than working by yourself. It doesn't compare to anything else.
You've had your share of controversies and critics. In fact, you shared the Nobel Prize with a frequent critic. Why do you think the Heuristics and Biases program created so much controversy?
Well, you know, in the first place, I'll question the assumption that we got more than our share.
Sorry, you're not allowed to.
I can't do that?
No. John? No, I had a ruling, but go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
You know, the heuristics, and I mean, you know, there were two waves of controversies and of questions. So within economics, you know, there wasn't a big controversy. People ignored it for a long time. Then when they started paying attention, they noticed that it was really questioning the idea of the rational agent, and that was a line of controversy. So that's where Vernon Smith and other economists, you know, began to not to really take it seriously, but began to question it and to dislike it seriously. Within psychology, for controversies emerged a bit later, and they were, you know, they were of a different type. People, in large part, I think the controversy about heuristics and biases came from the fact that that it became more important than we had expected it to be, and that when you get a narrow piece of work and it becomes kind of important, it will never be read properly. It is understood very differently. That is, people who read it think that it was meant to be written as an important piece. And that's not the way the stuff was written. So what you get is very peculiar things that arouse controversy. Anything that you don't say, you're supposed to be against. I mean, so I've had people criticize heuristics and biases because we don't mention social influences on thinking. So evidently, you don't believe in social influences on thinking. Just we had nothing interesting to say about social influences on thinking.
Emotion.
Or about emotion. We just, we weren't denying them. We had nothing interesting to say. So some of the controversies were really because this thing was being taken too seriously. It was being taken as an exclusive theory of how people think, which it was never meant to be. And also I think people really read into what we were writing. They confused the medium with the message. We were not really arguing against human rationality. In fact, I think in the 1974 paper, I can't remember whether the word rationality is even mentioned, but certainly that was not our intent. But it was read as a critique of rationality, and then people said that critique is unfair, and a lot of stuff happened around that.
Yeah, maybe, in a sense, people got confused between a critique of rationality and a critique of the rational model.
Oh, that is absolutely true. I mean, what our critique was, it was really a critique of a very extreme and I think completely unreasonable view of what rationality means, which means that it doesn't mean that you're all-knowing because it allows uncertainty, but it means that all your beliefs are internally coherent. And so that in particular, it means that if I ask you about a belief or a preference in isolation, and then I change the context, so I bring that belief and another belief together, you will not change your mind regardless of context, which a finite mind just cannot do. But that's part of the rational model, that beliefs and preferences have that characteristic. So what we showed was that was a non-starter. That really doesn't mean that people are irrational. We never said that.
So the rumor that you think people are blithering idiots, there's no validity to that.
I would go further than that because
but you have met some blithering idiots.
I have met some blithering idiots, but our research was not about blithering idiots for the following reason, that Amos and I were never very modest. We thought we were pretty bright, and every one of the mistakes that we studied and demonstrated started out because we either made it ourselves or wanted to make it. So we recognized every mistake that we made, and we really didn't think they were stupid. We just thought they were human.
When you and Shane Frederick talk about System 1 and System 2, you seem to come down strongly in favor of System 2 as the one that corrects the errors of System 1 and makes fewer errors on its own. But other people like Ken Hammond and Robin Hogarth and Tim Wilson and others suggest that both systems make errors, different ones, and each one could potentially correct or inform the other. They say the best thing is to listen to both. Then we have Malcolm Gladwell seems to suggest we should turn System 2 off altogether. What do you think?
Well, I entirely agree with your summary of Hammond and the others. We were arguing, and again, I mean, that's interesting because you've done what I was accusing the field of doing earlier. You have taken us too seriously. We were making a point, or more broadly than we intended, we were making a point about our line of research. And we were saying the errors that people make, which are intuitive errors, or System 1 errors, can sometimes be fixed by invoking System 2, and that the invoking of System 2 actually can resolve most of the controversies in the field because it explains when errors appear and when they disappear. I mean, that famous line of Gerd Gigerenzer, making cognitive illusions disappear, you make them disappear by invoking System 2. I'm a great devotee of System 1. I think we run our life on System 1, and we couldn't possibly work with System 2 all the time. It is just too slow. Have been writing for too long, but a paper jointly with Gary Klein, who is known for, as a great proponent of intuition at work, and where we're really trying to balance our views. And it turns out we very much agree on the roles of System 1 and System 2. And it's pretty much along the line of Hammond and Hogarth and others. I wouldn't turn it off, and I don't think that Malcolm Gladwell has it quite right.
You've suggested that we engage in adversarial collaborations, and you've engaged in a few. Can you say a bit about how these work and whether you're optimistic about their future?
Yeah, well, I mean, there is one thing that really doesn't work, and that's controversy. I mean, I think by and large, controversies in psychology are a sort of a painful waste of time. If you are a participant in them, you waste a lot of time being angry. And if you are an observer, you score it by the quality of sarcasm, and you know who is scoring more points. It looks like a boxing match. Nobody learns anything, or very little is learned from controversy, I think. So and I personally hate being angry. So I've been looking for a way of conducting the business with less anger. And the idea of adversarial collaboration came from that. And that was the idea that when people have a disagreement, they would try to resolve them. Now, and they would publish. Now, I'm not so naive as to believe that people who have opposing views will run an experiment and that one of them will give up. I mean, that just doesn't work. But through the act of trying, you come closer. And in that sense, my experiences have been constructive. So you end up writing a paper, and we don't have those papers, and we should, which is written in two voices. So you have, the idea that co-authors should agree is nonsensical. It actually forces us to write papers that are not as good as they should be. There should be an editorial convention that would allow co-authors, at least in the discussion, to lay out their disagreement. Because certainly they disagree very frequently. It's a stupid editorial rule, I think, that co-authors have to agree all the time. If we allowed that new degree of freedom in our publications, I think we would gain something. And that's part of the idea of adversarial collaboration.
Your first adversarial collaboration was with two of the nicest people in the business, Tom Gilovich and Vicky Medvec. And I can see having a friendly collaboration with them. You've never managed to have one with Gigerenzer, although you had one with one of his collaborators.
I had a collaboration with one of Gigerenzer's closest associates. And he came to my Festschrift a couple of weeks ago. So in personal terms, this really works. You asked whether I'm optimistic about the model after, 3 or 4 attempts, and the answer is no, I'm not, for several reasons. I mean, one of them is that, it's part of the business that the research was never completely conclusive. I mean, that's part of the idea of adversarial collaboration. But in at least 2 of them, the one with Hertwig and one with Bob Sugden, and a British economist, we did adversarial collaboration, and we ended up with a mess. We ended up not able to interpret the results. There is a model that I'm more optimistic about, and that I think is much more promising, and that I think could be enforced by editors, so I'm pushing that one more. And this is that when people when you get into the reply and rejoinder mode, which is one of the most hateful things there are, before getting into that mode, or instead of getting into that mode, and editors could enforce it, you force the people to write a joint paper, where the first part of the paper is they outline everything they agree on, and then in 2 voices, they begin to develop their disagreements. And I did that with a couple of people who had written something I was very angry about, and we ended up friends. So that can be done, and I think controversy, the way that we conduct controversy, is a problem, and it should be fixed.
So here's one completely out of left field, and I'm improvising, because the academic controversies of the usual sort remind us of the political process that we've been going through the last year. And I'm wondering whether there are any insights of this that we could have used to make, say, the debate between Barack and Hillary a little more civil.
Offhand, I don't see anything.
Yeah.
So I'm not
I
wish there were, but
yeah. Well, if you come up with something.
There is no editor. I mean, the point is that you need norms, and you need somebody who can enforce those norms. And in that instance, there just isn't enough of...
George Stephanopoulos isn't up
not
to...
quite,
right.
no.
You and I have been co-conspirators in developing the field now called behavioral economics. That field has been a hit, and the psychologists who were originally interested included not just you and Amos, but Stanley Schachter and Leon Festinger and Walter Mischel. I had not bad help in the early days. Now, besides Eldar Shafir and occasionally Dan Gilbert, there are very few psychologists who are even willing to talk to economists, much less collaborate with them. How come?
Well, the main thing that's happened, well, I'm kind of stealing from remarks I had planned for later this afternoon for the presidential symposium, but the main thing that's happened is that the field of judgment and decision-making has migrated out of psychology over the last 20 years. It is now in business schools. And so, there are a lot of collaborations. You just don't think of those people as psychologists. But in fact, there are more psychologists interested in collaborating with economists than there ever were. But their professional identity is blurrier than it was.
Well, then let me ask the question in a somewhat different way. Psychology research used to address real social problems: discrimination, diffusion of responsibility. Think of Milgram's obedience studies in response to World War II. You've often bemoaned the fact that economists have a monopoly on influence in Washington. How can psychologists get in on part of that conversation?
I mean, I haven't bemoaned the fact. I'm not envious of economists for having the ears.
Oh, you are.
No, I don't. No, I'm not. I'm perfectly content with having you do it, provided I have influence on you. And my line on this, and I've been quite consistent for a number of years, was I wouldn't know exactly what to do, with it. It is a fact of life that the economists are the gatekeepers with respect to policy. The economists and to some extent the lawyers. But when it comes to transmitting social science to government, the economists have it on every field. From education to psychology to criminology. Ultimately, it's the economists who translate the scientific literature, such as it is, into policy. It's just a fact of life. Let's accept it. That doesn't mean that psychology cannot be influential, but it means that the influence is very likely to be via behavioral economics, which is fine.
Yeah, but haven't psychologists sort of, let me push you a little harder. I've been working on saving for 30 years, and that's how I got to know Walter Mischel, because delay of gratification, that might be relevant to this problem. But, besides that and some related literature, I sort of didn't find any psychologists interested in this particular problem.
Well, I mean, you don't know how easy you have it. I mean, the point is that...
Easy for you to say.
Well, the point is that you get interested in savings, and automatically you have the ear of policymakers because you're an economist. So you couch your results, you have instant credibility. Walter Mischel wouldn't go anywhere presenting his research to to policymakers. You did it in an applied context, and you did it, and because you did it, and because of your professional, I mean, you are an economist, you know, even if not all economists are happy about it, but you are. And that helped you a lot. And so the reason, in the first place, I'll deny that psychologists are not interested in policy, because certainly in this context, in the context of the APS, you don't want to say that, because the APS is a journal, you know, the journal of, you know, which is dedicated to public policy and to contributions of psychology to public policy. You haven't encountered them, and they are not translated directly into policy in most cases, but they're ready and they can be picked up, and there is a lot, and I think psychology has a fair amount to offer, as this journal is showing.
Well, I agree with you, and I'm just probably trying to...
Provoke me.
Yeah, I'm trying.
It's not unusual.
Okay. Let me try again. Has your research on happiness had any influence on your own behavior? And has it made you any happier?
You know, at the margin, I think my research on happiness has had an impact on the way I think about my own life. You know, but it is also the case that happiness is to a large extent a character trait, and, you know, it's not one of my best things.
Yeah. That's all you're going to say? You know, we've got time to kill here, Dan.
Well, you know, there are several ways in which the kind of thinking that I've done about happiness is sort of relevant. One, I think, is a distinction between what you experience and what you think about your life. So it's the life that you experience and the life, you know, and the judgments that you make about your life. And entirely too much of well-being research has been concerned with how people think about their lives rather than about their experience. And so I've been thinking a lot about actual experience, and not necessarily about the memories that you form. It's a very different thing. So, you know, when people plan a vacation, you sometimes get the impression that what they're really planning is a photo album. I mean, that, you know, that the whole thing is the construction of a store of memories. But if you're just planning to have a good time, and actually it helps that my memory is awful, so I don't do much, you know, in hoping that I'll remember it. I assume I'll forget. But that orients you to experiencing the present and to doing things that you'll enjoy in the here and now. And in that sense, my research has influenced my life.
Yeah, but you've always sort of prided yourself on somebody who doesn't enjoy memories. I mean, well, I've never seen you take a picture.
That's true.
So,
yeah, I don't, you know, I very much live in the present. It was a difference between Amos and myself. We had that conversation a lot because he had that model of life as the accumulation of memories, and which I never did, even, you know, when my memory was much better than it is now. And we had many interesting conversations on that. It's an unresolved issue. Both aspects are there. And it's a matter of the balance that you put on one or on the other. How much do you do in order to maintain the narrative of your life, and how much do you do in order to live different?
The research in this area, it seems like it faces a bit of a dilemma, in the sense that you have, on the one hand, people like Norbert Schwartz, your collaborator in this, showing convincingly how fragile the assessments of happiness are. You can alter them by asking people how the weather is that day. And Given that, how much faith can we have in the answers to the questions that you
A
guys
lot
have
of
studied?
faith. I mean, there is that debate, about the validity of answers to questionnaires about happiness. And as we know from, a lot of other things, from our own line of work, you can show that answers are context dependent, and that doesn't mean that there is nothing there. So the idea that you have pre-existing preferences that you consult, you reject that. But from the notion that you construct preferences in context, it doesn't follow that there is no there is no basis for the preferences. There are differences in some dimensions of well-being. Some people are happier than others, and that is reliably measured, and it has physiological impact, and there are many manifestations of that. There are many dimensions of well-being. Some people are in a better mood, and others are sort of more satisfied with their lives. And the issue of reliability is there, and if it was very important, to figure out about this particular individual, whether he is or she is happy or not, then reliability matters. But when we're doing research on the determinants of well-being, reliability is just not a factor. It attenuates the correlations, but it doesn't necessarily change the structure of anything. And we are learning an enormous amount about the structure of well-being.
I know a lot of the research is on differences across countries. The French seem to be never better than pas mal. How reliable are these?
I mean, there are really almost dramatic developments, actually, in the research on well-being, because many of the myths that people have believed in are not true. So, for example, the French, we started out studying, comparing French to American because the data seem to indicate that the French are much less satisfied with their lives than the Americans are. Well, it turns out that difference is artifactual. It's a difference that emerges when you're asking people, how are you happy? And they're allowed to say, I'm very happy. Now, it turns out the Americans are very everything. They are very calm, and they are very anxious, and they are very tense, and they are very relaxed. And the French are just not very. So that one is gone. And when you look at the average mood of the French and the American, the French are actually, we looked at women, so I don't know about men, but French women are slightly happier in terms of mood than American women. And there are quite interesting differences. Now, the main thing, there is a myth that I'll take a minute just because that's an important myth, and it's been exploded. It's the myth that income doesn't matter. And in particular, many people believe that income only matters across poor countries. And, it levels off beyond, I don't know, $20,000. That turns out to be complete nonsense. And it turns out to be an artifact of the way that this graph has been plotted. When you plot, when you plot across the world, and there is now a sample of 250,000 people from all over the world from Gallup, when you plot the average life satisfaction against GDP, the correlation over countries is 0.84. When you take 150,000 people, individuals, and you correlate their individual satisfaction with life with the GDP of their country, you get a correlation of 0.44 across the world. So income matters, and it matters a lot. And there is a lot that we can learn that, that came as a complete surprise to me when I started in this field. We're just beginning to understand it.
What's your take on neuro? And let me ask that in two ways. First, how do you see it coming into play in the well-being kind of research? And then second, what's your take on neuroeconomics?
Well, among other things, you know, I'm kind of more pessimistic than all my friends, but I'm also more enthusiastic than most of my friends. And one of my enthusiasms has been, you know, the neuroscience and neuroeconomics in particular. I mean, I was a believer, you know, when you thought I was silly, and I was a believer when Amos thought I was silly. You know, this is sweeping the field. It's completely changing what psychology is. It's going to change social science. And I think it's going to change behavioral economics. And to an extent, I expect it to have an impact on economics, not only on behavioral economics. Because my guess is that economists are going to put a lot more faith in objective measurements of what the brain does than they do in subjective responses. They really don't like subjective responses.
So, well, it's clear that if we had, what did Pareto call it, a utility meter?
No, that's Edgeworth. He
Edgeworth,
called it
right.
a hedonimeter.
Hedonimeter,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, if we had one of those, that would be good.
Yeah, well, we'll have one of those. You know, it won't measure a single thing because there isn't a single dimension, but, you know, it's just a question of time. We'll have one of those, and it will be portable, and it will confirm a lot of what we know, and it will change some of the things that we currently believe. You know, this is going to happen, I think.
You are more optimistic about this than most things. Well, do you have any advice to young scholars?
Well, that's an ugly question.
John made me ask it.
Well, you know, the one advice that I'm certain of is don't pursue lines of research that are not paying off. I mean, that's been my main quarrels with graduate students, you know, throughout my career, that they would run an experiment and it wouldn't work. And then they would write 30 pages of discussion explaining it away instead of throwing the experiment away and doing something else. So you can overdo perseverance. And I think that's one of the things.
Ignore some costs.
Ignore some costs, follow your nose, do what you're enthusiastic about, you know, even if, that is, if you trust yourself. And if it's genuinely important. I mean, the thing is, you need to have the ability to recognize when what you are doing has some promise. And the mere fact that you have a new word, that doesn't do anything. But if you have a new phenomenon, then you might be onto something. And detecting, the ability to detect when you're onto something interesting, I think that can be trained, but I also think that's a talent. And it's one of the essential, you know, pieces that a good psychologist or a good social scientist needs.
Besides neuro, are there things at the frontier of psychology that you're excited about?
Well, I mean, you know, it's all neuro now. So it's hard to think of anything else that is moving as quickly in all domains. So I could say neuro and emotion, neuro and social. At the moment, I think this is what's exciting.
Have you read a good book recently?
Oh. Yeah,
That
there
was
was that book. Okay. I was about to forget. There was a book. Dick Thaler wrote a book. It's a very good book with Cass Sunstein. And it explains behavioral economics. And it explains the importance of behavioral economics in policy. And it illustrates the strange ways in which psychology does influence economics. Basically, you never cite a single psychology thing, I think.
Oh, that's not true.
Do you? Really?
I think you appear like on every third page.
Well, but I appear in my guise as an economist, no?
You have no guise as an economist.
All right.
Okay, well, I think we've run out of questions. So, Danny, it's been a pleasure, as it always is, and thank you all for coming.